Can a strong leader, someone who's truly effective, in the world of politics and power, also be a genuinely good person, morally? Or are those two things kind of like fundamentally opposed? That's what we're diving into today. We're looking at this piece called The Pagan Nature of Power. And let me tell you, it makes some pretty bold statements. It argues that holding political power, just by its very nature, might be, well, inherently unchristian. So to unpack all this, we're going to look at two figures from Russian history, Tsar Nicholas II and his grandfather, Tsar Nicholas I. We'll see how their lives, their reigns, kind of illustrate this whole complicated thing about power, morality, and faith. The source, it jumps right in, says that just maintaining power, politically speaking, often requires actions that, well, wouldn't exactly be considered saintly, right? Think about it.
Setting boundaries, enforcing them, even using force doesn't exactly scream, turn the other cheek, does it? And the source argues that if a leader isn't willing to use force to keep order, someone else, someone who is, will just step right in and grab that power. It uses the example of Tsar Nicholas II, sometimes called like good guy Nicholas, known for his faith, his compassion. But that made him hesitant to use force, even as things in Russia were, deteriorating. And sadly, well, we know how his story ends, tragically. The source contrasts Nicholas II with his grandfather, Nicholas I, who really ruthlessly put down the Decembrist Revolt back in 1825. The Decembrist Revolt, by the way, was this uprising, military officers demanding a constitution, more liberal reforms. They were essentially challenging the very core of Nicholas II's power, and he responded with absolute force.
Nicholas I, he was all about stability and order, even if it meant harsh measures. There's this chilling quote from him. "To be merciful does not mean to be weak. I am obliged to give this lesson to Russia and to Europe." He really believed that any sign of weakness, would just lead to more chaos, more uprisings. You see how his experiences and the source's argument about need for force, they're directly connected.
You see, Nicholas I, he had lived through the French Revolution, witnessed firsthand the brutal consequences when a ruler is seen as weak. And that experience, it really shaped his belief, and this echoes what the source is saying, that holding on to power, it often demands a firm hand, even if it means making, well, morally difficult choices.
His response to those Decembrists, though, rooted in his Orthodox faith, it gives us a glimpse into how different parts of Christianity have, wrestled with this whole idea of using force, the morality of it. For example, the source, it contrasts how Orthodox Christianity views violence compared to Catholicism. It points out that in the Orthodox tradition, taking a life, even in war, that's seen as a sin, something that needs repentance. The source even uses the example of the Byzantine Empire, that eastern half of the Roman Empire, strong Orthodox Christian tradition soldiers there. They weren't allowed to take communion, not for a whole year, after they'd taken a life in battle. It was a time for reflection, a way to acknowledge, the weight of what they'd done, even if those actions they were done, serving their country. And this is contrasted with the Catholic tradition of indulgences.
Which, as you might know, were basically a way to lessen the punishment for sins, even for, acts of war done in the name of the faith. So you've got these two different Christian traditions both grappling with this idea. Can violence ever be justified? And if it can, how do you square that with what your faith teaches? And this source, it doesn't shy away from the tough questions. It comes right out and asks, does it ever truly justify an action? Can something be necessary, unavoidable even, but still need atonement?
That's what I appreciate about this source. It's not afraid to dig into the hard stuff, you know, and it's not trying to tell you which view is right, which is wrong, but it uses those contrasting views within Christianity on power, on violence, to get you, the reader, to think about this tangled relationship between faith and politics.
So, acknowledging that there are no easy answers here, which leads to another question. If we can't escape this pagan nature of power, as the source puts it, this need for force, control, even if it means morally complex actions, what's the solution? How do we live with that?
Well, the source suggests a balanced relationship between church and state. It argues these should be separate spheres of influence, each with its own distinct role, but working together, hopefully, for the common good.
So kind of like a healthy partnership, where both sides have their own expertise, but they're working towards the same goal.
Exactly. And the source says this separation, it's actually a way to protect both the church and the state from, well, overreach, abuse of power. It uses the example of the church crowning a monarch. That act, the coronation, it symbolizes secular power being legitimized by this higher spiritual authority.
But doesn't mean they're merged into one thing, right?
Right. They each have their own lane, You've got the church focused on the spiritual side of things, moral guidance, and the state handling the more earthly stuff governance, laws. And because they're separate, they can kind of keep each other in check. You know what I mean?
That makes sense. So it's
Yeah.
not about one being like the boss of the other, but recognizing they both have a part to play.
Yeah.
And that balance keeps either one from getting, well, too powerful.
Exactly. And the source actually points out that within Orthodoxy, there's this big idea of the royal middle path, this whole concept of balance, avoiding extremes, and this separation of church and state. Perfect example of that in action. You're not saying one is good, the other is bad. It's more like they both have their place. They need each other to work right.
So bringing it all back around to our first question, if a leader really gets this pagan nature of power, that sometimes you need force, you need control, can they still be a good person deep down? Live by their faith?
It's tough, man, and the source doesn't pretend it's easy, but it does say that recognizing how hard it is to wield power, being honest about the tough choices it forces on you, that's vital for any leader who wants to rule well, but also ethically.
So not pretending those tough calls don't exist, but having like a strong sense of right and wrong to guide you through them. When you have to make a decision that maybe it's not ideal, but it's what needs to be done for the greater good.
Exactly. And that's where faith can come in, not to tell you what policies to make, but to give you a framework for, like, moral reasoning, figuring out the right thing to do in a messy world.
This whole deep dive has been really something, hasn't it? We started with a pretty basic question. Power, good or bad? And we ended up going through history, philosophy, even religion. It really shows you how these things, they matter just as much today as they did centuries ago.
No doubt. And yeah, the source talks about church and state, that historical context, but what's underneath all that? The nature of power itself, the challenges of leading. How do we square our actions with our morals? We all deal with that, even if we're not ruling countries.
That's so true. So as we wrap up, here's something to chew on. In our world today, the lines between, secular and religious, they get blurry. How do we figure out power, morality, faith, how those all fit together in our own lives? How do we balance getting things done with being decent human beings? Just something to think about.